Good afternoon. I think it's about time to start, so let's begin. Hi, I'm Tom. I'm going to talk a little bit about WebDriver Integration Testing with Perl. I'm a Perl consultant and developer. I work with various companies in and around London. And this talk is really about two things. And these two things are things that I've done at two different companies over the past couple of years. In both cases, we were writing a new application from scratch. We needed to write it really quickly. And most importantly, it needed to work. So the way we kind of went about this with no time at all was to automate web browsers and to write integration tests around those. So I'm going to talk roughly about those sorts of things. I'm going to start out by talking about the history of web automation, by which I mean behaving a bit like a web browser, but as a program, not as a human being. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the WebDriver protocol, the mechanics of how WebDriver works, how to develop with WebDriver, and finally, a little bit about integration testing with WebDriver. So first of all, the history. Well, people have been writing all sorts of automation things with Perl probably as long as the web has existed, definitely before Perl 5. But I'm going to start my brief history at this era of libwww, an HTML parser. These were originally all part of a big bundle of modules that's since been broken up into various other distributions, and these are still commonly used today. Basically, LWP is kind of really low level. It's in places more of an access to the HTTP protocol, and it is very kind of, you send a request, you get a response back, and then you can feed it to HTML parser to investigate the HTML. There are other modules that people have built on top of HTML parser that are still used today. One of which is WebDriver Mechanics. And this provided more of a browser-like interface, again, programming interface, around LWP. So you could say something like, go to the page, find this form and fill in these two fields, then click the submit button. So it's the language that we were using in Mechanize started to feel a little bit more like the language you would have in your head as a user using a web browser. And then TestWW Mechanize integrated with Perl's TestMore framework, so you could write integration tests for your web browser. And again, this sits around LWP and HTML parser. So you send your request to the server, you get the HTML back, you process it in Perl, you do things with it, which is how once upon a time the web worked. But over the course of time, people started adding JavaScript to their websites. And nowadays, often you will get a blank page if you don't have JavaScript enabled, because websites work that way. There are extensions to WebDriver Mechanics that hook into popular browsers that you can use to do stuff with that. But what these are doing is they're using the Mechanize interface, which is fine if that's what you want. Now, before all that, though, there was a project called Selenium that it was basically a really clever bit of JavaScript that would run inside your web browser. You would write code that would then make the JavaScript run web pages in a different frame and do things with them. And it was one of those clever things that shouldn't possibly work, but it did, and it was really useful because you could test your code inside a real web browser, not just something that's sitting around LWP. But the problem was, it was this JavaScript that was running within a web browser, and it didn't run as well in all browsers as other ones. And yeah, the cleverness needed abstracting out, which is what happened in Selenium 2. And Selenium 2 figured that, well, what we need for developers is a standard interface. And this is really where the WebDriver protocol comes from. And I'll talk in more detail about that later on. But sometimes it's very easy to confuse these two things because they kind of grew up together. Originally, if you were using WebDriver, you were using Selenium 2. If you were using Selenium 2, you were using WebDriver. But because WebDriver is this standardized protocol, you don't have to use Selenium to get a lot of the advantages it provides. So that's kind of a very rough history of some of the approaches people have taken to web automation in Perl. Did anyone see the 2010 movie, The Social Network, in which a definitely fictitious person writes a Perl script that shells out to wget? And this definitely fictitious person then builds the world's most popular social network and goes on to become one of the richest people in the world. So if there's one lesson to learn from this talk, if you want to make lots of money, don't just shell out to wget from a Perl script and you will be fantastically rich. I believe The Social Network is definitely a fictional film and in no way based on reality. And yeah, if you can't read this, it's this blurred in the movie as well, but that's what it looks like. So enough about Perl. Let's go on to the WebDriver part of it. So as I said earlier, WebDriver started out as part of Selenium. It's now been adopted by the World Wide Web Consortium, the people who write they used to write all the web standards now, most of them. And it's being kind of very carefully maintained. You can kind of send pull requests to the protocol. And because it's this standardized protocol, you can work with it in pretty much any language. Basically what it is it sits on top of HTTP. And like lots of popular HTTP-based protocols, you send some JSON to it, it sends some JSON back to you. And this is what you're doing in your Perl program, is basically just sending HTTP requests with JSON inside them, and then magically the browser does stuff, and we'll discuss that magic later. So how does the protocol work? In its very basic sense, you initiate a session. And a session is a bit like if you were to say, I'm going to open a new browser window. You start a new session, and then you can interact with that browser window. And you interact by sending commands. Now, earlier I mentioned that with LWP, you send the request, you get the response back. Now, with web browsers working the way they do, how do you know when a page is finished loading nowadays? Because people can often, you can get the HTML body, but then you might load some JavaScript, you might keep loading more JavaScript, it might be that the user hovers over something and more things load. So basically this is kind of an asynchronous protocol. What you do when you're sending a command is you say, I'm going to wait this much time for this thing to happen. And if it doesn't happen, then the protocol treats that the same as it not happening at all. And this is important for us as developers because we need to take a different approach. But it's an approach that works well with the modern web as it is. So, I said earlier it's HTTP and JSON. Basically, the HTTP part is to create a session. You just send that request. Once you've got your session ID, you can go to a specific URL. You would specify the URL in the JSON in the HTTP body. You can click the browser's back button. You can do things like click on a form field, enter a character, enter a string. So it really is very much a protocol that's modeled on the user's behavior. You can select a given element, and I'll talk a bit about how you select elements in the page later. So, like lots of protocols that are good, what WebDriver has is a very clear idea of what it is and what it isn't. The things I've described are all very much user interactions that describe the way that most people think about web browsers. So there's you can't, for example, say, I want to go and look at the HTTP response, because that's not shown in the browser window. You can't say, what's the HTTP status code, because most people don't know about that. My mother finds it really funny if she walks past a house with the number 404, but most people won't get that joke. But if you do want that, you can find things like Chrome DevTools, Marionette, and I think these are what the WebDriver the Mechanics implementations. Max wrote some of these, so I'm looking at him to check I'm right. And he's telling me that, yeah, basically they wrap these things. So I would say if you want to write code from a user's point of view, WebDriver's great. And of course, it's standardized, and it's in every language. It works the same everywhere. But if you do need to write more kind of technical tests that are inspecting protocol layer stuff, it's not going to do what you want. So, the mechanics. How do you work with this thing? How do you go about writing your WebDriver code? Well, there's more than one way to do it. But I think generally, you're going to end up with these 4 parts of what you're working with. If you write your WebDriver client code, that can be in a language like Perl or any other language that has a WebDriver client. That talks to the WebDriver implementation using the WebDriver protocol. And the WebDriver implementation could be Selenium 2, or it could be something else. So the Perl 5 clients that I've used are Selenium Remote Driver and WebDriver Tiny. They're both kind of different, so have a look at them both. Lately I've been using WebDriver Tiny, and its author is in the room, so I might say I prefer it. They're both fine. I'd say take a look at them both. The only thing I found with WebDriver Tiny is when you're looking at it, it doesn't have much documentation. But I actually think this is good, because basically it's a thin wrapper around the WebDriver protocol. So if you want to understand how to use it, go read the protocol spec or whatever. It works nicely. Okay, so your WebDriver implementation is then talking to your web browser. And they all basically, the implementations nowadays are often written by browser manufacturers. So for example, if you want to test with if you want to automate Firefox, you can use Gecko Driver. And if you want to automate Chrome, you can use Chrome Driver. And loads of browsers have WebDriver implementations nowadays. And of course, if you want to be old school, Selenium still exists. So you can still use Selenium too. And basically, the last part in this is that your web browser talks to your web application. And this is exactly the same as a user sitting in front of the web browser using the web server. So this is basically the real world. Only your users probably don't type as fast as your test code. OK. So enough about the theory. If you want to write this stuff, how do you go about doing it? And because I like I say, in recent years, I've done 2 kind of WebDriver projects, and I did another one in the past. And it took me a while to get used to, partly because of this asynchronous stuff, but also just there are lots of, I guess this is the war stories part of the talk. These are various things I've picked up. There are 2 ways, well, there are actually several ways of selecting elements, but the most powerful are probably CSS and XPath. XPath was developed for XML, but lots of things use it for introspecting any tree structure. CSS was less powerful, but every time I go and read about CSS, the selectors seem to get more and more powerful, and you can do things like find all the odd items in a list, or you can do things like, get me the second from last item in a list. And it used to be that I had to write XPath to find these things, and nowadays I find myself increasingly using CSS. So if you haven't read the recent CSS selectors specification, go look at that. And as you're writing your selectors, these are the things that need to be readable, because it's really easy to write very long XPaths that you then look at and you think, well, how did this ever work? Did it ever work? And they need to be maintainable. Maintainability isn't just about changing your client code. It's making sure that as the web application you're talking to changes, your selectors still work. So for example, if you were to say, I want to find the 3rd div, the 2nd div within that, and then the 5th div within that, if anyone goes and changes the front-end code, you're going to be getting totally the wrong div. But if you can use element IDs, element classes, things like this, it's much easier to have maintainable, robust code. And I think the ideal situation here is where you maintain the application as well as the test code. And of course, writing these selectors is hard, and you get it wrong. So whatever web browser you use, you're probably already familiar with its developer tools that let you inspect elements. But of course, if you've decided that you want to automate with 4 different web browsers, you're going to have at least some familiarity with all their developer tools, which can be annoying. But find out what extensions and plugins are available. Most of the browser developer tools I've used don't support XPath natively, but there are nice plugins that give you syntax highlighting and kind of help you figure out what you're doing wrong when your brain has forgotten how XPath works. Also, if you're using a front-end framework like React and Redux, it may be that there are neat plugins for this. Earlier this year, a front-end developer I was working with showed me these, and they saved me so much time. So that was good. Earlier, I mentioned that with the asynchronous nature of this, you have timeouts. And a couple of years ago, I was developing on a fairly fast machine, and I wrote all these tests, and they tested the application, and everything was really quick, and it was great. And then a new colleague with a somewhat slower machine arrived at the company, and the tests all failed on his machine because I'd set the timeouts too small. So my colleague, again, who's in this room, came up with a smart idea. Basically, I'm going to make the application as slow as you can. So in the catalyst, like the auto handler, the bit that accepts every request, just put sleep 5. And if your tests fail with sleep 5, yeah, your tests are going to run slowly. But if they fail, you can make your testing a bit more robust. So this helps you deal with the kind of the race conditions. Obviously, don't do that permanently, just on your dev box, just whilst you're making the tests a bit more robust. But yeah, I've found this very useful for someone going, the test's failing now. Oh, no, it's not failing anymore. Oh, it's failing now. Oh, no, it's now. Mostly these are timing issues. So slow your application down, and the timing issues will hopefully go away. And the last bit, testing. So we've talked about how to drive these things. What have I found by writing tests? Well, obviously we've got unit tests and integration tests. And unit tests are great because they target a specific piece of the code. When they fail, you probably have a very good idea what you've done wrong. Integration tests kind of test the whole thing. And when an integration test fails, it's often very hard to figure out why the thing failed. But what I like about integration tests is that they're much better for testing features that end users or your stakeholders really care about. For example, if you want to say, does the login form work? You can write 2 tests, one that fills in the username and password, clicks submit, and logs you in, and another one that fills in the wrong username and password, clicks submit, and it doesn't log you in. I was working on a project earlier this year where the security was important, and the easiest way to test the security was to do things like this, to try and do things that you weren't supposed to do, and check that we'd written our code better. The other thing I found around integration testing was I mentioned front-end developers earlier, and I was working with someone who had a fair bit of experience in PHP, but was mostly writing the Redux and React stuff. And he said, well, these tests are great because they keep spotting bugs, but you've written these tests, I want to learn how to write them. And I said, well, just copy and paste this stuff. And he basically had no Perl experience, but he was picking it up, writing integration tests. And then he was shipping the tests alongside his code, which was great because we found that things just got a lot more reliable when we started doing that. Okay. So often when I'm writing unit tests, I won't have kind of this second line in here. But with integration tests, things can fail occasionally, intermittently. So when they fail, think about what you will want to see and give yourself much more information about that. So if the test doesn't pass, give yourself some guidance why that might be. And it's worth understanding the difference between Perl's diag and note. I've seen a lot of people use diag everywhere. And what this means is when tests pass, they're really noisy. So I would encourage people to use note for every day, this is happening, and diag for dumping the error message. It makes your test suite a little tidier. Okay, so the practical side of how I've been developing things is I usually start out by writing scripts. Yesterday, Curtis talked a bit about selling to your business stakeholders. And I'm not very good at this because I am too much of a techie, but my bad trick for selling to business stakeholders is to throw together a quick hack in half an hour. And I've managed to do this a couple of times with these WebDriver tests, and then people run them. And they're like, oh, this is useful. And then eventually everyone's running them, and then maybe eventually you can get them into CI. So I start out with a quick hacky script, but as they get a bit unwieldy, I move the common code, things that I'm testing, into a test library. So I might have things like put username and password into the login form, or fill in the search form in this way. So then I've got this library of tests, but the problem then can be, in this library, if you're saying things like OK is not OK, all the standard Perl testing idioms, what you find is that the line numbers it gives you is the line number, when they fail, the line number is not in the test script, it's in the test library, and that's really annoying because you don't care about that. You want to figure out, in my test script, where was the failure. And Test Builder is a module that lets you do that. So if you're ever writing any testing library in Perl, make sure you use Test Builder rather than just putting in the standard OK and whatever. Now, I've not got to this stage, but I think it's worth mentioning that if your company really does love all this stuff that you're doing, you might find that you have to maintain a whole load of different operating systems, different browsers. You can use Selenium Grid to help you do that, or you can outsource it to other companies. So make sure you know that those options exist. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about the history of web automation, a little bit about how WebDriver works, how to code with it, and how to write tests with it. I hope that's been helpful. Thank you for listening. Cheers. Does anyone have questions? I don't know if we have. I guess we'll move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Is it possible to implement logging of an open AI authentication?
HTTP authentication.
No, not the HTTP authentication, the new stuff. Just OAuth.
Yeah, so basically anything that a user can do in a web browser, this protocol can do. It's just being the user.
Because it's based on a lot of UX caused by JavaScript.
Yep. So it supports all the one we found, which was interesting, was we were sending out confirmation emails, and we couldn't be bothered to write code that would pick up the SMTP side, so we just put an ugly hack in our code for that. But yeah, there are limitations if you're sending out of band messages. But if you're sending anything in band, that happens exclusively within the browser. Should be fine. If I'm conscious of time, if anyone else wants to come and talk to me about this, please grab me. I'm going to be around for the rest of the conference.